be talking about is the Nations system and the rights of Indigenous peoples and women, and the cultural rights of Indigenous peoples and women. This photo is the group of women that I actually work with in the Northern Territory in the Central Desert. They have given me a skin name, and my skin name is Quide. I'd like to acknowledge all the lands and territories that we're from and where you're sitting from today, and I'd like to also pay respect to our elders who have laid down the foundation for us. So I'd like to move on to the next slide. Okay, so the United Nations system consists of 6 principal organs. That's the General Assembly, the Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, International Court of Justice, and the UN Secretariat. The UN system includes subsidiary bodies such as separate administration funds and programs, research and training institutes, and other subsidiary entities. First of all, we'll speak about the General Assembly. So what happens in the General Assembly is that for us as Indigenous peoples, we go to the United Nations and we actually sit in the General Assembly, where you have the Secretariat also sitting in at the General Assembly. You have other Economic and Security Council. You have Human Rights Council sitting at some of these meetings. But I'll specifically discuss the General Assembly for the United Nations for Permanent Forum Indigenous Peoples. This is really an important, the General Assembly is very important, because what happens is that when we have our Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples, we generally have over 2,000 Indigenous people represented from around the world. And at the General Assembly is where we can actually lodge our complaints. So with those complaints, when we're at the General Assembly, you'll have the UN Special Rapporteur. You'll also have other Indigenous, you'll have a lot of the you'll have a lot of government sitting there as well at the General Assembly. And what happens is that that's where we lodge all our interventions. This is really, to me, is a really important area of work, because it is the main policy making organisations that comprises of many state members. So meaning state members, they are our country members. So the General Assembly, it's a unique forum where, like I said, and where we generally sit for us, there are 193 member states of the United Nations, and that's where they have equal votes. And here, one of the key decisions is where they appoint the Secretary General on recommendations to the Security Council, and they also elect the non-permanent members of the Security Council. They generally meet on regular sessions throughout September and December each year, and they have sitting arrangements in different halls. So what happens here is that this is important for us because, you know, they have issues that we raise. The challenges called for the General Assembly is critical, and it's really important that you understand what the General Assembly also is where they have powers to function and set under the Charter of the United Nations. One of the things that I want to say is that when they did select the UN Secretariat for the General Assembly, I was actually able to be on that interviewing process of him for that. So with him, there's the state members, they look at all of the financial issues. It's really the main organ. And for you in this area, I think it's important as well, as you need to know what the matters they are considering and recommendations that are for states, and what comes out of these General Assembly meetings. It's important for us because this is where a lot of the foundations are set upon. And like I said, it's the foundation for us, for the President to meet. At the General Assembly for the Permanent Forum, the president of the UN General Secretary, he generally comes to our meetings and opens up at the General Assembly, and that is the meeting in New York. We also have the Security Council and the Economic Social Council. To me, I think they're very important. And one of the things that I also have a very big interest in is the International Court of Justice. And that International Court of Justice has played a role in, you can take matters there into that International Court of Justice, and also with the UN Secretariat, that's where the Permanent Forum, the Indigenous person sits. But we'll just talk about, because I've got a few things to go through, we'll talk about the UN Secretariat and what their role is and how important they are to us as Indigenous peoples. So the UN, the role of the Secretariat of the UN is that he carries out the administrative work for the United Nations as directed by the United Nations. So the person who is in place here now is Antino Gutrio. Sorry, I can't pronounce his name. He's the 9th Secretary General of the United Nations. He comes to the General Assembly when we're holding our Permanent Forum meetings, and he generally opens that up. So where's he located? He's from South America, and his role also, I think, is really important because I remember the last General Secretariat, and he was from Mr. Moon, and he was very, very good. Came to a lot of our conferences and was really interested in Indigenous people's issues, because one of the things that we must remember, and I say this all the time, we as Indigenous people, we are the largest human rights movement in the world. There are over 500 million Indigenous people in the world. So that is really important for us to know. And that's important why we must know who the UN General Secretary is and why he must get involved in our work when we go to the General Assembly or we have our Permanent Forum meetings, because for us, we need the support of the United Nations. Though they have mechanisms in place that include us, they include us at the table, and they actually have an interest in our roles as stewardships, and that's who we are. We have many different languages around the world. We are the traditional knowledge holders for the world, and the General Secretariat, has that interest because of what we do and the role that he can play in supporting us when it comes to our violations against minings or anything like that. This is where he has to have an interest in our work, and it's really important. So also when you look at it, there's programs, there's research, there's different funding. So we have the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, where you can actually go and put in to go to any of the UN meetings. That's a subsidy from the United Nations, and it's really good for you to have a look at those UN voluntary funds in case you want to go to Geneva, in case you want to go to the Permanent Forum or any other thing that they are actually have that voluntary fund for any of the COPE meetings that are held generally around the world. So that's a really important thing for you to know. What I want you to do is have a look at individually how they can affect you and what the principal organs are to you in your different countries. If we can move on to the next slide, that would be great. Okay, so the United Nations, and this is really interesting for us, and the systems that they have for us as Indigenous peoples. So how important are they? What are they to us? So the United Nations systems and the rights of Indigenous peoples and women's. States shall take measures in conjunction with Indigenous people to ensure that Indigenous women and children enjoy the full protection and guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination. What are the 4 key principles of the United Nations Declarations of Indigenous Peoples? It provides that the declaration must be read in accordance with the principles of justice, democracy, respect for the human rights, equality and non-discrimination, as well as the principles contained in the UN Charter. So I want to just discuss the UN Declarations of Indigenous Peoples and how important that is. There are different other mechanisms that support us. We have CEDAW that supports us. We have all these other different mechanisms. We do have these treaties that our states have obligations under, but sometimes those treaties, and there are like the UN Declarations for Rights of Indigenous People, in Australia that has not been ratified. So that's not legally binding for us, but it is a principle, and it is also a moral obligations that states abide by when they're using the UN Declarations of Indigenous Peoples if they are not ratified in your countries. And so for me, how would I use this? How would I go about using this when it comes to an issue that I feel that the United Nations systems and the rights of Indigenous peoples and women are protected? So I use this when I'm writing any of my submissions or anything into the UN. I write using those declarations of Indigenous peoples because we must use that. That is the only principles that is our rights in human rights. As we know, for us Indigenous peoples, we don't have a lot of human rights, but we must look at this UN declarations as our new world of order for our rights as Indigenous peoples. That's why it's important that we use this. It is the new order for us. It's the new world order for us as Indigenous people, us as a collective, for our human rights. So that's why if you're ever looking at how can I write into the UN, what can I do? Use this declaration because that is the new world order. We know we have so many issues that affect us, but we don't have that collective of a human rights protection. And this is what the UN Declaration is. And like I said, it's about justice. It's about democracy. It's about respect for our human rights, equality and non-discrimination. And I've used this plenty of times in my work here in Australia when it comes to our rights for women especially, and our rights for equality and our right for justice, because for us, I am working with a lot of women, especially in domestic violence and with sanitation and water. We don't have a lot of water in some of our areas where it's remote because it's so desert. So when I write about this declaration that we must use it and when I'm writing to governments or anything, I use this because it's a protection. Because if we don't use that, there are a lot of legislations and a lot of other policies that aren't protecting us in our own countries. So that's why this declaration is quite important for us to use. So if we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So the International Mechanism for Indigenous Peoples. The United Nations has 2 forums of work and dialogue extended specifically for Indigenous people, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the Expert Mechanisms on Indigenous Peoples. For Indigenous peoples, there's a special procedure specifically for our concerns called the Special Rapporteur of the Rights of Indigenous People. It is possible to send communications to the Special Rapporteur on situations that Indigenous people in particular countries or to invite her to visit the country. However, where applicable, it is necessary to have the approval of the government in question. At the end of the field visit, the Rapporteur will issue observations and recommendation. It is then important to follow up on these. And I'll give you an example of what happened, how we use the Special Rapporteur here in Australia. So that was with Vicky Talakoris. She was the former Special Rapporteur. We had 150 Indigenous communities that the government was going to shut down. And they weren't, because over here they say you need to have your land lease. But the government said, we'll close them down if you want the basic water, education, the basic human rights of health, you sign a 99-year land lease or we'll shut the 150 communities down. What happened is that we said no. So we wrote a letter to the Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people, requesting that she do a country visit on the situation that was affecting us and 150 communities here. We asked her if she could come and go to some of the communities as well as visit other places in Australia and write a country report about how it was for us as Indigenous peoples and our issues of them closing it down. So she came to Australia, Vicky did, and what she did is she then wrote a report. She went on her country visit. She had a look at, wrote about the issues that were affecting us, and wrote about how the recommendations that the government could work with us as Indigenous people, and how she supported some of our issues. And so what I did is I thought, I'm going to write a letter to her as well. I'm going to write what I think that issues that I want to raise with her and that I felt that was important to her. So in writing that, I wrote a letter to her, and I'll actually read out what some of the letter that I did wrote. I wrote a submission to the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and I also wrote and I'll talk about that later, a shadow report. So what I did, and this is what I want you to look at when you're writing letters, I wrote an introduction about what our organisation was about. Then I wrote a small summary about the different policies and laws that are affecting us and that are relevant to us as Indigenous women in Australia, and that I wrote to her about some of the requirements that the government had made attempt to, and about I put in some of the outcome documents, and I also wrote about that we needed to have data. And then I wrote in my submission to the Special Rapporteur about the defunding that they were doing to organisations here. I then wrote a letter, in that submission I wrote about the family law courts and about how that the recommendations from the previous Special Rapporteur had made comments about in Australia and the government, what their priorities was in protecting us as Indigenous women and about the violations of that. So I wrote back to Vicky and I explained to her about the previous visit and about how we needed legal assistance and about the courts. Then what you need to do is, when you're writing to the Special Rapporteur, give them case examples of what has actually happened. So I gave her case examples of, in relation to domestic violence and about how it affected the courts and a child and everything. And I done that. And then I wrote about, we have over here a traditional adoption, and it's called Kupamayasa, our traditional adoption, in one of the areas, and how that was not recognised in the courts and how we needed her to support us in that court. I wrote about the history of the Indigenous traditional adoption and how important that was. But I also then wrote to her in this whole submission, I wrote to her about problems arising, with our traditional adoption. And then I wrote in it about, I then put the recommendations in it, and I requested that all organisations, request the United Nations, the Special Rapporteur for Indigenous People, to support peoples in the Torres Strait and people in Australia, and to convey similar support for legal recognitions of our traditional adoptions here in the government in Australia. And we also further recommended her to direct attention to call upon states and government to take appropriate steps to coordinate our legal system and properly fund our legal systems that the state needed. Then I wrote in our recommendations that women and children who are arrested and held in custody have full access to medical and legal services. And then I further wrote that the Special Rapporteur call upon states and territory to follow and analyse consultation to suitable safe homes for Indigenous women, and also to specifically work with Indigenous women who were at risk and to help the effects of homeless people and domestic violence. So that's an example of what you can write. You can write how many pages you want, but I highly recommend, if you are writing to the Special Rapporteur, to make sure that you put your recommendations up on the top. So that's one thing that you can actually do. You can go onto her site and have a look at what the Special Rapporteur does and the communications and the country visits and the reports that she does. Go and have a look at that, because this is what you need to learn. And, you know, the information we're passing on, it's good to share with your community and to share with other organisations in your communities, because information is power, and that's about sharing that as well. And that asserts us our rights. It gives us a pathway to understanding where we can get country visits from special rapporteurs. And like I said, I also wrote to the Special Rapporteur on domestic violence for Indigenous women. If we can go to the next page, that would be great. Thanks. Okay, how you can use the United Nations system. So this is another thing, I'm always writing letters. So the Universal Periodic Review is a unique process which involves a review of the human rights records of all member states. A unique process which involves a periodic review of the human rights records of all the 193 UN members. My advice is for you to go on and have a look at if your country is a UN member state and if there has been a periodic review. So like I said, you could draw attention to the Special Rapporteur, and that you can ask for violations to be stopped. And I'll give you an example of what I did for the periodic review. Like I said, I'm always writing letters on behalf of my organisations on this. So what I did was I then wrote a letter the periodic review is that you can go in and have a look at that country visit. And what that country visit is that your government will write a report saying, okay, this is what I'm doing for Indigenous peoples here. This is what I'm saying and how I'm helping them, and whatever else they will say, whatever they want to say, actually, and they'll make it try and look good. But what I did is I went in and had a look at the periodic review before they came to Australia. So they came to Australia, they'd done a review, say 8 years ago, and then they were going to do another review. And then I went back and I had a look at that periodic review of what they were going to say. And I wrote a shadow report. And in that, with that shadow report, is that I spoke in that shadow report, and I said about how I gave them a quick summary, and then I wrote in articles from that shadow report. That was articles 1 and 2 about equality and non-discrimination and states' obligation. That was in the report for CEDAW. And in that I've done a short summary, and then I've done a short summary. And then I've done the rights. I spoke about how we're not in the Constitution here, and because our Constitution in Australia is not a human rights one. And I write about how important that they were going to say that they were going to work with Indigenous peoples in their human rights, but how can they help us when we're not even in ours is not even in the human rights in our Constitution. Then I gave them case examples of how they failed to protect us in our human rights, and when they said in that periodic review that they were protecting us. And I spoke about where they took away our rights. We had a Racial Discrimination Act in one of our territories, and they took that away, the government, and that gave them the power to go in and try and take control of some of these Aboriginal communities. And so then I looked at the temporary measures that they are supposed to take under housing and all of that. But then I put in in the submission to under the UN to the periodic review. I also spoke about some of the the recommendations that the Special Rapporteur wrote in her report that the government wasn't doing. And so in that, I spoke about also the critical issues of affordable housing. So in the periodic review, I spoke about when the last Special Rapporteur, she quoted, "Housing remains in short supply of Indigenous people." Go back and have a look at some of those reports and put them in when your country is going to do that periodic review. This is really important to write and to know how that UN system can help you in doing that, and talk about that, how there needs to be more investigations. And so one of the recommendations that I gave was in this, that, the government weren't helping us enough, even though they said they were funding us and doing these things. I wrote and said that, the government needs to invest in housing, again, more housing for domestic violence, and about early interventions, and also about our equality towards the law, and how they failed in investigating some of the deaths of some of our women over here, and about how they're failing in that system. Yet they said they're protecting us, yet the government and the police were not investigating right, because to me, that investigation by the police was very important. And then I spoke about the law and justice framework that they were supposed to be putting together, but they didn't do that. And then I put in, because of the investigation in some of the deaths of some of our women, I wrote in quotes for what the coroner had actually put in place, and said that every police station is a detainee. So it's really important to go back and do a bit of research. But this periodic review is really important for you to know, and to actually how you can do that, and how that UN system can report. And again, I wrote about data. We all need to have the right data, because when we're putting in anything, we need to say, this is our percentage to everybody and everything like that. So we'll go on to the next slide, because I am concerned my battery may run out. And like I said, I'm sitting in a car. So now I want to talk about culture rights and Indigenous peoples and women, how we have the right to maintain culture and control, protect and develop our cultural heritage, traditional knowledge and our traditional cultural expression. And that's under 31 of the UN DRIP. So this is really important to us, because what I'm showing you here is our little seeds. These seeds, they grind them down and they make, in one of the communities I work with, and they make the most beautiful bread out of the seeds. But that's our traditional knowledge, and we need to protect that, because our food is our health, for our health and well-being, and we know how to use that food for medicine and everything like this. So we have to have a right to protect us. Though under the intellectual property, they don't see us as a collective, they see us as intellectual property rights is generally about the individual. But we must continue being a voice and saying we have that right as a collective to protect and develop our cultural heritage, to have our traditional knowledge and our traditional cultural expression, because we are the knowledge holders to our medicine. We're the knowledge holders to our seeds, and we know, because from generation to generation, that we should be able to carry that. But also, in speaking about this, we have a lot of non-Indigenous people that come to your communities and say, we want to film this, and we want to know what your seeds are, and we want to know the medicine. Too many times we share that with us, and those people go away and they make a lot of money. So this is how we've got to protect, and we need to have protection by protecting that by having things in place, to protect us, having written agreements, but also about our frameworks that we put together, and that we've got to have that free, prior, informed consent. This is where it comes really important, because we've got to be able to say, well, if you're coming in here and you want to use our traditional knowledge, and how do we protect it? Well, we're not going to give you everything, but we want to make a benefit sharing from that. You're going to go and make a film up. We want to make some money out of this because we are the richest in culture, but we are the poorest people in the world. We can't be sharing everything and losing that because here in Australia, they shared this very special, it's called Gumby Gumby. It's a tree here with a leaf that is very good for cancer and cleaning and everything. And the people in that community share it. So what happened is that this white lady came along and she then patented that. She has full ownership now of that plant. And this is what's happening. People are patenting our knowledge and they're owning that. Whereabouts, do not give anything away. I say to people, don't tell anything. How we protect that, we've got to be a collective. Look at how you can patent your traditional knowledge. Look at free, prime, informed consent. When people come to your community, okay, this is what you must do. We want to know exactly what you're doing here. We want to know how you're going to use our knowledge. And we want a written agreement that whatever you do, we want to have benefit sharing. Share with us the fundings or the money that you are getting and that you're making out from what we're having here. It's very important that you understand this because if you don't, this is where we're going to get ripped off. I'm very concerned I'm going to run out. So let's please move on to the next slide because I do have a low battery. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. So this is how you protect your cultural rights. What you need to do is, and all of this, be included in the discussion, always at the table. Apply laws or anything that are affecting us. And if there's something going on that is not good for us, make public awareness. This is happening to us. Our culture right is being overrun because somebody's taking away our cultural rights for our land or our cultural heritage of our traditional sites of knowledge, our sacred sites and that. If somebody from FEMI can please send me the link that I can phone in on as well, please, to my email, because I am going to run out, but I do want to join back in on the phone. So what we've got to do is, how do we protect our religious and cultural rights? How do we use and control our ceremonial objects? Encourage dates. Be at the table, make public awareness of what they're doing. Focus on priorities. That is really important. So focus that on priorities at the moment. And I'll give you an example of what's happening to the Maasai people. Over there, the UNAE want to take over the land of the Maasai people. They want to just take over and use that for gaming. So they're trying to shift the Maasai people out of their land. And so what they're doing is the Maasai people, they are looking at doing public awareness. They are rising it and saying, look, this is what's happening here. So if you're having issues of land or mining or everything, raise public awareness about it. Be included in the discussions. But also it's very important to turn screen off to save battery. Okay, I'll do that. I'm not quite sure how to do that. But anyway, so it's very important to be at the table for anything. But if there's an opportunity to, like I said, to write to the Special Rapporteur, ask when they come if you can be included at meetings with the states if the Special Rapporteur is having anything. It's really important that you be at the table on this and raise that all the time. Like we said, you have marches, you be included, you apply the law. And sometimes it's good to also have, I'll just turn my camera off. Sometimes it's really good to have, other big players in on the pitches and unite as Indigenous people. Unite. You are all here as sisters together from around the world. If you have an issue or anything, unite and share what is happening. Share what you need to do to raise public awareness on how to protect your cultural rights. on how you need to look at those treaties and mechanisms. If you have laws that take that to court, sometimes you can get pro bono lawyers from around the world who will help you do that, and look at what you can do to protect those cultural rights and how to do that. It is very important that you learn to do that. This is so important. Because if we continue to be enforced removed, if we continue to be losing our cultural rights or our sites, and then we're forced into cities and that, we start to lose our traditional knowledge, we start to lose our language. And then, for me, I can't speak my language because of the forced removals that we have. So this is the sad part of that. You lose all of that. Whereabouts, we don't want to do that. We want to protect and maintain our ceremonies. We want to protect our customs because that is the foundation to who we are. They're our spiritual guidance. They give us the knowledge on how we survive in this world, how we have the knowledge to protect plants, animals, and protect our medicines and everything like that. So that's why it's very important. If we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so what is all this about? This comes to our self-determination in that UN system. The right to self-determination is contained in Article 1 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the article of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and External Sites, and this is also contained in Article 3 on the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And like I said, though it's not Indigenous legally binding, there is obligations, and there are informed ways to encourage governments to engage with government and protect the rights of self-determination because of Indigenous people, because that's what we want. That's why free, prior, informed consent, having all these UN systems are important to us, because we have to continually have self-determination as Indigenous peoples. We have to, it's us as Indigenous people with our self-determination that, that we go ahead and that we continue to carry on and we make that decision on who we are. So we determine our own statehood. We determine our own processes that we have to control our communities and our history and everything. So that means that, it's a progress of choice. It's a progress in ensuring that we meet our social and cultural and economic needs for our communities, so that we continue to, like I said, make an economic gain, because we don't have, the mining we have corporations coming in to us all around the world that continually take away our rights for what we're doing. So, how do we exercise that? Why and how would you exercise that self-determination? Apply it. So what you do is, an example is using that free, prior, informed consent. You then make up your own contracts if somebody wants to come in, because we all look at what the contracts of people coming in or filming or wanting to know everything is. They say, here's our contract. No, your self-determination is that you write your own contract. You write what they want. You write about your benefit sharings of money, that the monetary sharing of money. I'm a lawyer actually, and I had this lady come to me and she does this beautiful artwork, and her artwork is all around Australia. Sadly, the person came in and took her artwork and said, we'll sell it to you. And she only made a contract of 2%. That person makes about $3 million off her artwork, a white person. She only gets 2%. So now what you got to do is, how do you take control of owning that artwork and making a percentage of that, or owning your medicine and making a percentage of that, or owning, your anything that you do what you do, because we're all business women, remember. Also, we have our arts and crafts. People want to come along and buy something. How do you make a percentage of that? If somebody wants to come along and say, well, I want to do this for you, for your community. No, you sit down with your community as a collective and you say, we have that self-determination. How are we going to create this, and how are we going to negotiate for our self-determination when it comes to different things in our communities or anything like that? And that's why it's really important that you understand what the UN system can do for you, how that system can work for you, and how important it is for you to be able to look at that periodic review, how you can look at how you can look at self-determination, how you can look at free, prior, informed consent, because these all come under the UN systems, the UN systems of mechanisms, UN systems of treaties, the moral obligations that the states have with us. That all comes under this. So if we can go to the next slide, and then I'll take questions. So this next slide is me going around and working with Indigenous women, and I show them how to negotiate. I work with them on their businesses and do workshops with them and talk to them about how they need to negotiate for money, or how they need to negotiate for anything, for, policies or legislations, or even how they need to know their rights when they go into court, because we all need to know our rights, and that's what it is, that's self-determination. Look, I want to tell you something. We're not, we're going to lose some fights and we're going to win some fights, but it's important to use some of those treaties and obligations and the knowledge I'm passing on to you to win. And not necessarily win, but it's about how to negotiate for your rights as self-determination. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Is there any questions? Hello? Can you hear me?
This is Nicole from New Mexico. And
hi, Nicole.
I really appreciate how you broke down the United Nations and how to use the treaties or the written language to protect our culture and our teachings, as well as to negotiate to get our needs met in that way. This was really informative to me. I was really listening to. I don't have a question because I'm still digesting everything you just said.
So what I might actually do, and I'll get that sent to all of you, and I don't have it in Spanish, sorry, but I have an example of how you can write a periodic review. And I have examples of free, prior, informed consent, and I may be able to send that out in Spanish as well as English, just to give you examples on how then using that free, prior, informed consent, how you can negotiate, and when people come to your communities or reservations, what your rights are under those free, prior, informed consent. And I'll send you the periodic review, and I'll actually send you an example of what I wrote to the submission I wrote to the special rapporteur, and I'll have a look at those things, because this is why you're here doing this school. It's about us giving you information and sharing some of the knowledge that we have, because it's about then you working on it, but also sharing that knowledge in your communities and how it comes to that self-determination, because that's what we want in the end. We want our self-determination. There are things there in place. And like I said, we've got to keep fighting the fight, because we know that we lost a lot. We have, been overtaken, we've had, different the invasions and everything, but we've come back and we're still here. And like I said, we are over 5 million Indigenous peoples now as human rights defenders. So we're not alone in this world. And that's why build your network up with each other here, support each other and share that information if it's, really important. I've got a question here. Do we get to have direct negotiations with states during permanent forum? Yes, you do. Yes, you do. You can actually, what you can do is you can write a letter to the permanent forum, write interventions in. And so when they read out your interventions, some of those things are where the secretariat, the Indigenous Permanent Forum secretariat, will read back some of that to the states and ask the states, okay, for example, okay, this is just an example, okay, in the US, say, or in Canada, where they had the murdered and missing women. This is a prime example of what happened. In Canada, they raised it so much over there at the Permanent Forum that, what are the states going to do about the murdered and missing women in Canada? Well, actually, the response was then Canada would do a review, and that's what they actually reviewed. So, there was such a big calling at that during the Permanent Forum in the states that done that negotiations. There's something there in Spanish. If the if someone can read that out to me, please.
Yes. The International Court of Justice is it autonomous from the United Nations, or is it linked to it? How is it connected to the United Nations?
So it's got a seat at The Hague, and it's one of the judicial organs from the United Nations. That's what it's about. So the role of the International Court of Justice is it's to resolve disputes involving a broad range of interstate or international matters. That's what happens in the International Court of Justice. So that's what happens. In the International Court of Justice, there's 15 judges there, and they actually have a look at that. So that's why. So what can they do? It's it's where you can take your matter. It's that international. You go in there. So is there ruling? Is the ruling legally binding? The judgment is final, binding to all cases, just in case there is an appeal. So that's why the International Court of Justice, it's the organ of the judicial system for the United Nations. So it's one of the principal organs. So it's the only international court that adjudicates general disputes between countries with its rulings and options. So it's good to have a look at that. And look, there is a case, and I will try and I'll have a look at it. That is an Indigenous matter that is going into the International Court of Justice. And I'll write a little summary about that case that is going there, and I'll send it. And I'll actually ask if Femi can actually send that, translate in Spanish as well, because it's important that you understand what yous can actually do that in what yous can actually do that. So what I'm reading is that what happened is that there was a Nicaragua case where Nicaragua brought an issue of the United States compliances, and they took that to the International Court of Justice. So this is where it's about international peace and security. And I'll actually have a look at that, and I'll give you, like I said, it'll give you an example. I'm a person who likes to give case examples to people. So that's what I'll do. I'll give you a case example of an Indigenous case that went into that International Court of Justice. So then you can actually, how do I use this for my, I can take a matter to the court. And I think maybe, I'm not quite sure what other ladies from Guam is in there. I think there's a matter that may be from Guam that is being looked at in the International Court of Justice. So it's quite good to start using and having a look at that, but it's hard for me to explain. But what I will do is I'll send you the free prime form consent, I'll send you the periodic review example, and I'll send you a case example of how an Indigenous group has used the International Court of Justice. So what do you think of that? Are you all happy to receive that information from me? I'll send
Yes.
it anyway. Yeah, because it will be really good for you to all have a look at. And look, if you're interested in knowing any more or want to have that direct communication with me, I'm more than happy to, Femi, to share my email if you want to know other things and other questions that you want to ask. And once I send all the information to you via the email, there's something that you may be interested in doing, or how do I do this, I am more than happy to go through another process with you in helping you do that, okay? And that's what this is about, how to use that UN system, but how, for me, how I can help you use that UN system. I can explain everything on here, but some of you may have examples of how you want to do that. So it'll be great for you to have that in a written document on how you can use some of these things. So time's going to run out for me because I am going to have to go soon. I could only be on for the hour, but I'll do my other hourly work with you in doing writing and showing you and sending that information. Anything that you have from FEMI, from this school program, I highly, highly advise to keep, because information and the documents that are here are really relevant and very important, because you can go back in another 3 years of time and say, hey, I learnt that at the school. I want to know how to do this properly. There may be somebody you may come across and say they want to know this. We're teaching you to be the teachers and you teach other people to be the teachers. It's all about knowledge and everything. So is there anything else that anyone would like to ask?
I had one. Hi, Sandra. This is Shaban from Guam.
Hi,
On behalf of Kara and Nihi. But I was really interested in you bringing up the differences between, or the different systems within the UN, specifically the Court of Justice for Human Rights you kind of brought up, because Guam has a very extensive history of going to the UN, but
yes.
specifically in a decolonization aspect, whereas recently with the risk to our water and the impending lead contamination risk that we're facing after the firing range becomes operational in about a year. We have about a year to stop that contamination risk from becoming imminent. It feels a little bit different from, I guess, our usual ways of using the UN and going to talk about decolonization in terms of the political process versus, I guess, this other system, which is going on a very specific human rights issue that is kind of a little bit more urgent. And I guess I wanted to, since you brought up these other systems today, well, one, I wanted to thank you for bringing that up, but also just because Guam has such an extensive history of going to the UN, what would it look like if we tried to go there via a different system or bring about our issues within a different system or a different mechanism? But yeah.
Well, what I would do is, because you work in media and you have such a good media outlet, you do very
Mhm,
good filming. I would really highly recommend to do a film and maybe
mhm,
share it with every one of your colleagues here and start sharing that information out. That's a
mhm,
way of getting that public awareness, because the
mhm,
more you share it, the more also there are lawyers around who can take that out. But can you send me that in an email, and then maybe we can have a look at, okay, what other system that you can look at, because I'm not
mhm,
having, I'm a person who likes to read everything. That's why I send
mhm,
everything
mhm,
out for people to read. But send
mhm,
that to me via email, and then we can look at the processes. Okay, does that fit yours? That fit you? And I
mhm,
would recommend writing to the special rapporteur, or
mhm,
even to they have the special rapporteur on water and environment. I would even
mhm.
write to them.
Yep.
That person is really a very good person. I spoke to them once at a meeting, and so I would write to the rapporteurs that can come and do a country visit and
Mhm,
ask them to do recommendations. So get their support. And so having that behind you and having that then see if you can go to Geneva is a very good place where you can put in, the Human Rights Security Council have been at some of the meetings there in Geneva and put that out, do public statements, share that around, but send it to me in writing, and then we can maybe look at doing that. But, while you're here at FEMI, do a little film clip and send it to all your colleagues and ask FEMI if they can then put it in a English small dialogue of Spanish so that it's getting that out and really raising that awareness. This is what I mean. Get that priority, send that out.
Thank you.
So is there anything else, or is everybody okay about that? And like I said, I'll send a list out. I'll do that all next week and send it to you. I do have contact details and everything. And anybody who wants to write to me, once you do have my email address, I've done this last year with the FEMI group, and I had some women write to me and they wanted to do a few things, and I was able to do a couple of things with them coming from this conversation. Look, I'm not the be all that knows all, and it's not, like I said, sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, but it's about putting our knowledge together to try and get that information out, to negotiate for our self-determination, for us as Indigenous women and children, and about our basic human rights and how some of these UN principle systems can work for us. Some may not, but as long as we get that message out there and pass that on within to those UN principles, but really look at the periodic review and really look at writing to the Special Rapporteur to come and do a country visit on some of the Pacific issues. Yes, so Nepal does have a really big issues there, and ensure Indigenous to their territory despite being the signatory, so that we can. And so, look, you need to write to the Special Rapporteur. I don't know whether Nepal always comes up with Indigenous issues. Why don't you look at how? And I'll have a look to see maybe when if you do have a periodic review, and how you can write to them. But really, when we're doing these things, some of us have to take consideration of our safety. But all of us have to think about our safeties, and even our special rapporteurs when they're doing country visits. So maybe what you can do is have a look at some of those things. Again, if you can write to me about about the issues and about how the mechanisms that you can address, and some of these, like I said, you can, and use the UN voluntary funding to go to some of these meetings in Geneva, the CEDAW meetings, the Permanent Forum meetings next year. Use the voluntary funding to go to some of these meetings so that you can do face-to-face of what your issues are. I went to a meeting in Geneva this year, and there was a young girl from Russia there, Indigenous girl from Russia, and she raised the issue. And the guy from Russia, he went off the government. He stood behind her, he had her in tears, he harassed her, but we stood together and supported her. And she used the voluntary fund to go to Geneva to raise the issues about, oh no, she was not from Russia, she was from Ukraine, about the issues in Ukraine and how she really took a very big risk, but she was only a young girl. So use that voluntary fund. Have a look at the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, where you can write your message, in Nepal, or any of you from any of that. If you aren't going to the Permanent Forum, check those UN voluntary funds so you can make the journey to put in a submission, so you can voice personally at the UN what your issues are. And when you're writing any letters, like I said, please make sure that you put your recommendations up on top. And generally the UN, when you're writing into the, putting in interventions, they only like about 1 or 2 statements, 2 pages, very short. But make sure you have each other's organisations written down there as support for your interventions as well. So, you know, if you've got 10 organizations from around the world supporting your intervention, that really helps as well. It goes to show you're on a global stand, that you have Indigenous organizations and people from the other countries supporting your issues. So that's really important to do. But like I said, have a look at that voluntary fund, especially some of you that need to go to Geneva, need to go to the CEDAW meetings, need to go to the CSW, need to go to the permanent forums where you can raise that face to face. Sometimes you may not get to speak at some of these forums. That's okay. Hand your interventions to the Secretariat's team and say, please, this is very important for you to look at my intervention. This is about my country. You know, do that if they're face to face. So that's what you can actually do with that. So is everybody okay about that?
I have a
Sorry, yep.
question.
Yep.
I'm Regina from Indonesia. So there are so many cases like in Indonesia about land grabbing and criminalizations against the indigenous peoples because they are protecting their land. So I would like to ask you if you could share a case that is similar to us. So and what kind of mechanism we could use to address that kind of situation, because in Indonesia we actually ratified the United Nations Declaration on the right of indigenous peoples. However, the government still now haven't like give us a proper instrument to really could use that kind of mechanism.
So if you can write to me about that issue, because I am in an organisations with the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International and the Special Rapporteur, the UN Special Rapporteur, the former ones on that organisation. I mean, can you write to me about your issues? And I would really like to maybe bring it up with them to see what we can actually do for Indonesia or what advice they can actually give, because we know, you know, how it is there for you. So can you write to me about that, and I'll see what that organisation can actually do or what they have in place for you.
Okay, I will write it to you once I get your email.
Yeah, do that. So is there any other questions? Because then I've got to get going actually to go and catch this train. I hope that you all found this useful, this session. And like I said, I'm more than happy, and I did this with the last years with the group, you know, walked with them individually to help them with a few things. Yeah, I know it's supposed to go for 2 hours, but just talk to you now. And like I said, a lot can be sent via email to each other. That's where we can work a lot more and get a lot more work done individually to help you. Okay, so I might leave the session if that's okay. And thank you all very much for joining it. Okay. Is anyone from FEMI on? I'm not quite sure. I think they may end this session, but it is being recorded as well. Yeah. Thank you very much. And like I said, please write to me. I will send out my email. I'm traveling. I won't be able to write until next week. And I do have your address, and work together. You all have different expertise and experience and skills yourself. Share that amongst each other so that you can empower each other as well. Okay, well, you all have a good day, and please, I will send information to you all. I'll see if Femi can translate anything in Spanish, and you all have a good day and a good evening wherever you are in this Indigenous world. Continually to stand proud and continue to stay strong. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bien, buenas noches, compañeros. Espero me puedan escuchar. Adelante, hermana Hortensia.
Good evening. Go ahead, Sister Hortensia.
Buenas noches.
Good evening, everyone.
Gracias por estar nuevamente acá.
Thank you for being here once again. Today we have begun in a slightly different way, and we are very grateful to our sister Sandra Cream for her sharing her experience and information about how the UN system works, especially the figure of the Special Rapporteur for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Now, we are going to have some dialogues by region. So we will divide into 3 groups so that each region can share with each other about the rights of Indigenous peoples in each of your countries. So we will do that for about 20 minutes, and then we will come back to the plenary or to the main room to be able to share a little bit about what we have learned and to talk about the reality of the region. So for those of you who are helping us, could you please divide us out by regions? We have 3 regions in which we can share our experiences, and each group will need to choose the spokesperson who's going to share your conclusions in the plenary. Hortensia, I have it prepared for 2 groups, 1 group with Winnie and 1 group with you. Is it okay that way? Okay, that'll be okay. 20 minutes then.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yes,
Winnie.
we can hear.
Right, perfect. How is everyone doing?
Pretty good.
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 So we'll just start right away. First I'll ask that someone please volunteer to take notes that you will present in plenary after we finish our discussions. Can anyone do that, please?
I can take the notes today.
All right, thank you so much. So I think what we will do is have everyone go around to share about your human rights situation, and if if any of the mechanisms that Sandra has spoken about today has worked for you, or if you've interacted with it before, please let us know. But you can also let us know about some mechanisms that you use in your own country. Yeah. So I don't know if is it easier if I just call out who I can see on my screen, and we can go from there.
Sure. I think that works.
Yeah.
Also, Pema just said she'll be sharing hers in the chat.
On the chat, no worries. So if anyone else wants to share on the chat as well, I think it would be great. So we can then maybe start with Annie.
Yes, hello. I'm from India, and I'm not very sure. I mean, I somehow learned, few things from today's session. But in India, I'm not really sure how do we take up, the rights of indigenous people. Like if you're talking about my own state in this country, then I see a lot of violation in terms of, I think, when we mention about economic rights, the natural resources are being drawn from the indigenous area, but they do not have any share. So it's like big corporate parties, who does this gas thing, but the actual indigenous people has no share. So sometimes it's quite difficult. I have seen like those struggles, but then there's no follow up, or nothing is being done. So it's kind of little demotivating, and how to take up this in the UN level is a big question, I guess, which I really want to understand, and how to go about it. So maybe if some of our sisters can, share on that and help me out with that. That's the question that I have.
Right, and thank you so much. Does anyone want to respond to her before we move, or maybe you could respond to her in your response to the question or the discussion we're having right now. And I want to call on Irene. Irene, please go ahead.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Here in Kenya, what I think is Kenya does not have specific legislation on indigenous people and has not yet adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But the people who are trying to well, like bring bring the issues on the same so that they can they can recognize the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Thank you.
Irene, you broke up a little bit there. Maybe I don't know if it's my internet, but I hope it's probably my internet because I have shaky connections today. But we can move on to Regina.
Yes, thank you, Winnie. Actually, as I mentioned before, that in my community there are a lot of cases with regard with the land grabbing by the oil palm plantation, and also criminalizations against the indigenous peoples, because you know about the APIC. Sandra mentioned before, actually, in our country, that the land is belong to the government. So even if it's indigenous land, we don't really have it like legally. So the government can issue a permission to oil palm or to the mining company to have their plantation in our land. So when the indigenous peoples like trying to protect the land, there are a lot of criminalization against it. For example, in 2008, when our activist was being criminalized, and it takes us like years to get him out of the jail. And what we did was we tried to find any law that apply in our country that connected to the cases. For example, with the plantation law and also the land law and something like that. Because as I mentioned before, even Indonesia has ratified the UN draft, but till now the government haven't issued any instrument for us to do that. And then even if we write to the United Nations Special Rapporteur, it's the special rapporteur needs a formal invitation from Indonesian government to come to our country to address the issue. And then so far our government didn't really want to do that because it will raise any because they don't want to raise any things against Indonesian government. So it's really hard for us. But right now that we successfully get out our activities from the jail after like 6 years of being in a court, it was like resources consuming and stuff, but you have to try to be united, because what we do is we invite all the indigenous peoples from other community to come to the court during the hearing seasons. So it's kind of like stress them to realize it, because there are so many people in front of the court building and stuff. So that's what we do. And till now we are still working on having back the land that they grabbed actually. And for oil palm plantation, we are working with the report to the Roundtable Sustainable Palm Oil, which is its organizations. So you can make a report to them and report the company, because without being a member of the Roundtable Sustainable Palm Oil, the oil palm company Indonesia cannot like export their oil palm abroad. So it's really important to them to not get any warning or suspension from the Roundtable Oil Palm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina, for sharing. Maria, please go next. Maria? All right. Maybe can we go to Nicole? All right. Nicole?
Yeah, sorry. No, I'm here. I was just pushing the wrong button.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. So the United States has 557 federally recognized tribes. So they're all sovereign nations, but there's really interesting government to government relationships. And usually, and also like this form of indigenous rights, what did she call it? The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, like it hasn't been ratified in the United States. So the issue that I'm wanting to talk about or bring up is about reproductive justice and Indigenous midwifery, because right now a lot of the births that we have in our communities are within the hospital setting. So 90% of women birth in hospital. There's no legal distinction for what Indigenous midwifery is. Because of the history with the colonization with the US government, like a lot of our cultural practices were like legally taken away from us and then re-given back to us probably about like 20 or 30 years ago. And so now with the Roe versus Wade being overturned, abortion access is also an issue in a lot of our states. In the state of New Mexico, it's still safe to have illegal abortions, but we're seeing an increase of people coming in and needing that kind of support. So we did go to the Geneva in August, and we created a shadow report with 13 other reproductive Black Indigenous organizations during the third committee hearings, and we were able to lobby for increased access to care and funding for grassroots organizations, improving maternal health care for Indigenous people. But I know for this Indigenous Forum that's going to be coming up in April, we've not done any type of lobbying or support or language around reclaiming Indigenous midwifery in the US, or even abortion access or service care that I know of. But that's kind of our issue. The challenge, though, is because this Declaration of Indigenous Rights is not ratified by the United States, it's a question of like, how do we enforce what we're saying at the UN in our tribal communities that are each sovereign lands? And it doesn't change anything with the US government or with the state-to-state governments. I'd basically have to lobby with each individual sovereign nation to improve birth, maternal health, abortion access, Indigenous midwifery, and even down to Indigenous women's rights, because a lot of our tribes are patriarchal and not matriarchal. And so Indigenous women actually have less rights in some Indigenous communities than the men do. Like some of them can't even vote on their government or own their house. And those are individual issues for tribal nations and not like an overall, I can go to the US government and change it.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Nicole. If 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 I'm not mistaken, I think all your countries have signed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Yes, the US had initially, the US, Canada, New Zealand, and I think Australia, had initially voted no, but then later on they accepted it. But now, I wasn't there for the beginning of Sandra's presentation, but I don't know if all of you know the difference between a declaration and a convention, in that one is legally binding and the other is not. So for instance, the UN trip is not binding. And so even when a country signs it, they don't have any legal, there's nothing legally binding them to to take into account what the declaration says. Not like a convention where there's actually legal, you can report your country for not upholding things that are said in a convention, but for a declaration you can't. So I think I will confirm this information, but from what I know is that all your countries have been able, have signed and accepted the UN DRIP, but just in the implementation part is always a problem, not just for declarations but also for conventions. But yeah, but as we go through this process, we will. Nicole, I see that you've unmuted.
Yeah, I guess the way I understand when a declaration, like, so when we went to the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination with our shadow report, because the US had ratified and has to report every 5 years on how they're improving or addressing this racial discrimination in the United States. Every 5 years they have to give a report of how they're addressing these issues, and then the shadow report is written of like how they're not being addressed. And so my question is, with this Declaration of Indigenous People that we're talking about, how do we hold our state and our government accountable if our governments they might have signed it, but did they ratify it? And is there a way to hold them accountable other than just using the language? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand. Now, unfortunately for all of us, really, is that we rely on the goodwill of governments, where they actually say, well, we see you, we recognize you, we will uphold your rights. It's based on goodwill, and they'll always come up with reasons as to why they have not done what they said they were going to do. And so what again in the next a few weeks, what we'll see is we will look at now, like the third or other mechanisms that we can use to hold our governments accountable, because even the articles that are held in this other how do you call them, conventions, contain things that are already there in the UN DRIP. And so we use the UN drip as not this is not the we always say it's not the ceiling, it's the bare minimum that any government can give, not just any government, but also we use the UN drip when we are advocating for spaces in other UN bodies. So the UN drip is our go-to when we're looking at what's the basic rights of indigenous peoples that every institution, government and non-government, should be looking. So that's a document that is specific for us. But we use that, what's contained in the UN drip and what's also contained in other conventions. And so what we try to do is we constantly try to put in articles from the UN drip when we're advocating, so that we can continue to raise its importance in the different spaces that we're in. Does that kind of maybe perhaps answer your question, Nicole?
Yeah, I guess I'm always like, I also did some training with the CERD committee, which is like indigenous, like the rights of women. And so I'm always looking at like how to use this, like how we used this platform with the UN around reproductive rights and indigenous midwifery, is that language now is in official documents that can be shared. And this person who spoke to us talked about like the media, like definitely getting lots of media attention to get like our issues out there is definitely an important part of not just going to the UN to lobby, but like writing op-eds and things in addition to what's submitted there to move the work forward. But yeah, I know when I heard about this Declaration of Indigenous Rights for people, I was really excited. And then I went to a line item 23 and 24 in there, which talks about women's like Indigenous rights and reproductive rights. But it's not a very really expanded in other parts of this forum that's going to happen in April about Indigenous midwifery, because you know, like reproductive and birth isn't something that a lot of people advocate for, but it should be, because that's how we come into the world. It's just as important as land and water issues, that they all are attached to each other. But I was just like curious on like how to use this, you know, to make a change in my community, knowing like they're all independent. Like I almost have to go to each individual one if I want to make a change specifically to these things.
Yeah. And in many of the sessions we're going to have with the Colombia or with the other experts, there's going to be a lot of sharing on how you can use this tool and other tools to advocate for your rights. Just before we get sent back, so do you want to say something? I'm so sorry. We've taken so much time. I just saw the message that we're going to be thrown out soon. Oh.
Es una manera de represión también a nuestra opinión o a lo que nosotros queremos expresar. Por ejemplo, quería acotar que en Perú todo esto se ha levantado. Nosotros estamos en una convulsión política y económica, y todo ha empezado simplemente porque el pueblo puso a un presidente, tal vez que no tenía las capacidades, pero era alguien que era parte de nosotros. Y ellos han agarrado, han empezado a discriminar, a ejercer racismo, y eso es que ha hecho que los pueblos se levanten. Entonces, ahora los pueblos que están en pie de lucha son justamente los pueblos indígenas, a los cuales se están vulnerando sus derechos, se los está oprimiendo, ha habido muchas muertes y nadie dice nada. Hacen como si las vidas de los indígenas fueran menos de las vidas de otras personas, ¿no? Entonces, creo que en todo lo que hemos considerado, ahorita voy a modificarlo para poder expresarme en la plenaria.
Gracias, Bridani. Pues de hecho ya estamos en plenaria nuevamente. Esperamos de que cada grupo haya podido discutir, compartir y analizar y nos damos cuenta que tenemos mucho en común, pero también hay situaciones muy particulares a nivel de cada país. Entonces, para aprovechar el tiempo, vamos a dejarle la palabra al grupo donde estuvo coordinando o dirigiendo Winnie, por favor.
Hello, I'm Shaban. I took notes for our group, and a couple of the common things that came up in our group was that a lot of the challenges our different Indigenous communities face is not having access to Indigenous like recognition in our communities. So Maria from Kenya talked about having, like, in their local government, they have no specific legislation for Indigenous peoples, and it makes it difficult for the people to have access to instruments for justice. Pema talked about how in Nepal, while they have a constitution which recognizes them as Indigenous people, and they have specific places in their community where Indigenous, whatever, schools or resources are available, the actual participation of Indigenous people within their government is not really seen. From Indonesia, Regina talked about how land grabbing is a really big issue, and in order to, so from the lesson today, we kind of talked about how the mechanisms that the UN provide kind of almost require compliance from your local government, and how this can sometimes be a struggle because, for example, if the Indonesian government doesn't want to recognize or allow visitations from the different rapporteurs that can kind of visit your country and do a report on your human rights situations, it's kind of difficult because Indigenous people are being criminalized when they're trying to protect their land in Indonesia. In Kenya, Irene also talked about similarly just getting local governments to even recognize the Declaration on the Rights of Human, or on the rights of Indigenous people, is difficult. Ani talked about how in India, it just in general, going about pursuing this big kind of change is a struggle. And then Nicole from representing different recognized tribes in the US, how it's the challenge is that because the Declaration on the rights of Indigenous people isn't legally binding versus conventions which are, it's hard to enforce something when you're administering power, or the government that is in control of where you live as an Indigenous person doesn't feel like the pressure to actually change things. Specifically, and then for me in Guam, I kind of identified a lot with what Nicole shared, because our and we also don't have legal distinction or recognition for Indigenous midwifery, and our access to maternal health care is being threatened, with abortion access being currently we don't have anyone in Guam to provide that in any legal or Indigenous way, because that would be illegal. And so kind of just looking at the themes across our group, the big challenge with using the different instruments that the UN provides to assert your rights can be difficult to understand if we don't understand kind of how it's actually going to hold our governments accountable. I know for Guam, the Indigenous people struggle because every time we go to the UN, we're there to kind of revisit our colony status. And because Chamorros don't have self-determination, it kind of puts a lot of our ability to assert our rights in a box, because a lot of our human rights issues stems from not being able to govern ourselves as Indigenous people and not being recognized as sovereign. And so anytime we do try to make moves against the American government or the American military, we're kind of up against a very challenging wall. And even going to the UN and pursuing decolonization, we have a history of going there, but kind of that not really making significant changes in our home country. But yeah, that's kind of a summary of what we talked about.
Gracias, Giobón. Gracias por compartir las realidades de los pueblos indígenas a nivel de dichas regiones. Y ahora pues escucharemos las conclusiones y parte de las experiencias de la región de América Latina, y le voy a dejar el tiempo a Bridani, por favor.
Bueno, hermanas, buenas noches con todas. Nosotros hemos estado escuchando a cada una de mis compañeras. Lo que pasa en América Latina es tan similar a lo que acaba de mencionar nuestra compañera, que hemos llegado a estas conclusiones. Por ejemplo, nosotros tenemos un tema con lo que son las organizaciones y sociedad civil, al no poder brindar su opinión, nosotros al dar ya sea organizaciones civiles o organizaciones o sociedad civil, las que dan su opinión, estas son ya calificadas por una postura política, o ya las que clasifican por ser traidores a la patria, o por estar en contra de la patria, o en contra de la soberanía. O sea, son totalmente perseguidos. Todos los líderes que emitan su opinión con respecto a cualquier accionar que está mal del Estado, o algo que está siendo injustamente actuado, ellos no se puede dar alguna opinión porque son perseguidos, o son calificados por algún sector político, o los consideran neoliberalistas o comunistas, ese tipo de cosas con respecto a dar la opinión, ¿no? También hay dificultades en cuanto a nuestro territorio. Los territorios en América Latina están siendo invadidos por terceros y están siendo explotados sin cuidado alguno. Esto está afectando a todas las comunidades indígenas. En toda América del Sur tiene bastantes riquezas en la tierra, la naturaleza, ya sean los minerales, palos, madera, todos los recursos. Estos son explotados, pero no son explotados ni de una manera adecuada, y son explotados sin, sin el consentimiento de las comunidades indígenas que viven en ellos, ¿no? Por tanto, están siendo vulnerados los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Se ha hablado con las autoridades, pero no se encuentran respuestas. También se coincide en el tema de lo que es la discriminación, la violencia contra la mujer, los matrimonios forzados. Todos estos temas coinciden en América Latina, y todos estos están afectando a las comunidades indígenas, a los pueblos indígenas, ¿no? No de, todo esto sigue afectando a los pueblos indígenas. Pero también ha habido un pequeño avance que se puede ver, que es que los pueblos indígenas ya pueden alzar su voz, ya pueden dar a conocer lo que piensan, ya pueden decir o entender qué está bien o qué está mal, o también pueden ya conocer sus derechos que tienen cada uno. El avance tal vez ha sido mínimo, pero hay avance. ¿Y cómo se está logrando estos avances? Justamente teniendo la oportunidad de poderse expandir o tener la intervención en este caso del exterior, en este caso de otros países, ¿no? Para que todos podamos unir una fuerza y podamos entender que no estamos solos, y que todos tenemos estos problemas. Esa es la conclusión.
Gracias, Bridani. Pues definitivamente parte de reconocimiento al trabajo realizado por diversas organizaciones, también por nuestros líderes y lideresas que ya han partido a otra dimensión de vida. Son los logros que hoy tenemos, quizás en teoría, porque en la práctica aún nos falta mucho. Las decisiones que se toman de manera unilateral, porque tenemos el derecho a la consulta. Sin embargo, en la práctica, este derecho no se respeta, y también por los mismos intereses de los gobiernos centrales. Y las mujeres en esta situación, en estos contextos también hemos aportado, hemos trabajado. Sin embargo, la situación de la violencia sigue afectándonos directamente, tal como lo compartía la compañera de México. Las muertes violentas de mujeres se dan día a día. Y creo que es una situación que compartimos en América Latina muy fuerte. Últimamente, como se compartía, el crimen organizado están llegando a nuestras comunidades. Y en cada situación, pues en cada contexto, hay situaciones muy complicadas. Y entonces quiero preguntar si alguien más tiene algún comentario, algo que aportar o preguntar en relación al tema que ha compartido nuestra invitada de hoy, Sandra Kramer, y también con relación a las diferentes situaciones que hemos compartido. ¿Alguien quiere hacer algún comentario? Bueno, nos quedan unos minutos y antes de cerrar, pues también queremos disculparnos por la forma en que iniciamos el día de hoy, pues prácticamente tenemos una agenda. Sin embargo, la forma también en que ingresó nuestra invitada, no la presentamos. Eh, Así es de que buenas noches, buenos días y buenas tardes. Sabemos que estamos en diferentes horarios y hoy pues también teníamos programado, teníamos dentro de nuestra agenda la invocación, y si no lo hicimos al principio, pues también lo podemos hacer como cierre, invitándolas a bueno, de hecho de América Latina ya tenemos asignada una fecha, los voy a compartir con ustedes, pero invitando también a todas las participantes a comunicarles las fechas a sus coordinadoras, a sus asesoras, para que vayan ingresando sus datos en el registro. Así es de que muchas gracias por estar conectadas, gracias por su participación, seguimos invitándolas a que tomemos la palabra sin temor, en libertad y en total confianza. Y si no hay una información más por parte de la coordinación, entonces en unos minutos le vamos a dejar el tiempo a Elizabeth de México, quien está preparada para nuestra invocación. Era de apertura.
Okay. In the chat, I am sharing with you and the email Sandra. Okay. And I would like to, inform you that we take attendance in each session. Okay. Okay. I would like to inform that your attendance is important, and we take attendance in each session. Okay. I was in the chat.
Muchas gracias, hermana Lucía. Muchas gracias, hermana Hortensia. Pues sin mayor demora agradezco y queremos hacer la invocación para este cierre. Bien nos dicen que a lo mejor no lo hicimos al inicio, pero quizás en este cierre para irnos con todas las mejores energías. Entonces quisiera que todas donde estén podamos cerrar nuestros ojos, podamos hacer la invocación de hoy. Yo tengo aquí a la mano agüita como símbolo que el agua es un elemento vital, el agua nos une, el agua es un elemento que nos da energía para todas que nos encontramos en todos los rincones del mundo para que nuestras vidas, nuestras mentes puedan fluir de manera importante, que podamos también sumerger como nuestras abuelas y abuelas lo hicieron. Quiero también, hoy esta noche aquí en México, pero en la mañana para las que están amaneciendo, despertando, para aquellas que están comenzando el día, quienes están comenzando la tarde, también poder tener una vela, prender la luz que nos pueda guiar en nuestros caminos, en nuestras luchas, en nuestras organizaciones, en nuestras familias. Esta luz la pienso dejar toda la noche para que pueda en cada una de nosotras guiarnos, pueda también nuestras mentes cargadas de energía, pero también mantener nuestra vida amorosa, nuestra vida con alegría, que esta resistencia de nuestras abuelas, nuestros ancestros, ancestras, sean abrazadas por nosotras, sus nietas, sus ramas de este árbol. Entonces, enhorabuena, hermanas, gracias por la noche, por el día de hoy, que podamos reunirnos por este medio, agradecer a FIMI por esta importante labor que hacen para unirnos a pesar de la distancia, y también agradecer a cada una de ustedes que hace posible, a la hermana de hoy que estuvo como ponente para que también su día sea un día fructífero, lleno de armonía, y que así sea, así sea, así sea. Gracias.
Gracias, Elizabeth. Gracias por unirnos energéticamente. Sabemos de que cada una de nosotras tenemos una manera diferente de comunicarnos con ese ser superior a nosotras. También le llamamos con diferentes nombres, pero sin duda alguna nuestras energías, nuestros sentimientos, nuestros pensamientos trascienden a ese punto, esa unión que tenemos y que buscamos en este espacio. Muchas gracias. Pues también hemos concluido con esta parte, esta sesión del día de hoy, de esta noche de hoy para nosotras, y las esperamos el día viernes. Por favor, revisen sus agendas, su programa, los programas, y siempre conectarnos unos 5 minutos antes para que estemos puntuales cuando se inicie el programa de cada sesión. Y también informarles que se está monitoreando la participación de cada una de ustedes, por lo que recordarles que el 80% de asistencia es la que tienen que ir acumulando. Así es de que muchas gracias, buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Nos quedan unos minutos más, pero por hoy vamos a cerrar acá, pero en las próximas vamos a concluir con el tiempo que hemos establecido. Por cualquier duda, por favor, abóquense a sus asesoras regionales. Gracias también a todas las traductoras, al equipo de FIMI, que maneja todo el sistema de comunicación, y a mis compañeras Joy, a Winnie, a Lucía, esperando que tengamos una feliz noche las de acá y que todo les salga bien en las otras regiones. Gracias, hasta el viernes.
Thank you, everyone.